Welcome. Hopefully you have been successfully able to log in and join us again. My name is Travis Chepkema, President of Church and Casualty Insurance Agency. With us today also is Julie Ludwig, our Director of Marketing. And we are happy to welcome back attorney Erick Becker. Erick is with the firm Cummins and White. He is a specialist in labor and employee relations, and he has done great webinars for us before, very knowledgeable in the employment arena, and we're thankful to have his expertise with us today. Just a couple housekeeping items. This will be recorded, so I'll say that a couple times, or at least once. This will be recorded, so that's the question we most often get asked up front. So you will have the ability to come back and review this or send this on to someone else to check out. And then also the Q&A feature, which is right down at the bottom of the screen. We'll be taking questions throughout. There is a raise your hand feature. We would ask that you not raise your hand during virtually during the presentation, and ask your questions in the Q&A feature. And Erick will present for about 45 minutes, and then we'll spend the last 15 minutes going through the questions you may have. So with that said, welcome, Erick. Glad to have you back.
Thank you, Travis, and thank you, Julie and Church and Casualty, for having me back to present on this topic. When we were talking a little bit earlier this summer about topics for this webinar, Julie and I both said, there's probably going to be a lot of developments and a lot of things that we need to plan for going forward into 2022 regarding COVID. And so we decided to build this webinar around how are we going to deal with the road ahead, not only with our employees, but also with the volunteers and congregants of each of your organizations, and really planning for and getting used to a new world. We know we're almost 2 years into this pandemic, and it doesn't look like it's going to be ending anytime soon, unfortunately. And so this is going to be something that we're going to be living with probably through the rest of 2022 and maybe into the future. So there's a number of different topics that I want to cover today. I know top of mind for a lot of people, because it's in the news, is the vaccine mandate, and we're certainly going to cover that, but also a number of different topics that have been coming up over the past months and will continue coming up as we go towards the end of this year and into next year. So let me quickly cover what we're going to, or not cover, but discuss what we're going to be talking about. And I'm just trying to get there we go, my PowerPoint to move forward. So here's our topics on really discussing the road ahead when it comes to COVID. Number one, I'm going to be covering in some detail proposed vaccination mandates, not only from the standpoint of the employee mandate that President Biden recently announced, but also from the standpoint of other mandates that may be coming down the road on the employment side from state and even local jurisdictions. And also, how do we deal with not the legal requirements, but what your organization might want to do in terms of mandates for other people that are participants at your church or religious organization, your volunteers, your congregants, your guests, etc. So we'll spend some time going into that. I will caution you at the very outset, a lot of the materials when it comes to vaccination mandates are complete unknowns at this point. So I know there's going to be a lot of questions on this particular topic, and probably a lot of my answers are going to be, we're going to have to wait and see. We don't really know a lot yet about the details regarding the vaccination mandates on a federal level or on a state level, but I can give you some pretty educated guesses on what we can anticipate going down the road. So our second topic will be proof of vaccination requirements, another very changing area right now in terms of whether or not employers can require proof of vaccination and in what circumstances and what kind of proof, as well as private businesses and organizations such as churches in terms of letting people enter into facilities. So we'll spend some time talking about proof of vaccination, and that's going to vary again by state, by even local jurisdictions. And so I know that there's many people on this webinar that may not be in California, and you're going to have to look at what is particularly going on in your state and in your county or even in your city when it comes to things like vaccination requirements, because that likely will be changing as we go forward. Next, I'm going to briefly touch on the status of legal challenges to restrictions on attendance at religious gatherings. There was quite a bit of litigation regarding this earlier in the year. And for those of you who didn't follow it very closely, I'll talk a little bit about what the courts have said regarding restrictions on attendance and what we can anticipate going forward. And lastly, I'm going to generally talk about COVID safety requirements. What are the requirements for the workplace? What requirements can you as a entity impose on people who are coming to your facilities or participating in your events? So again, I'm trying to cover two different grounds here in terms of what do you have to do with your employees and what do you have to do with your volunteers and congregants. That is one aspect of it. The second aspect of it is what is a legal requirement and what can you choose to voluntarily do when it comes to maintaining health and safety around COVID. In other words, there's a distinction between what the government says or government agency says you have to do as either an employer or as a nonprofit organization, and what you choose to do as an employer or as an organization vis-a-vis your congregants and your volunteers. So we always have to keep in mind the law is going to require certain things to be done. There's certain things that employers and nonprofit or businesses cannot do, but there's certain things that the law permits you to do but doesn't require you to do. So I'll try to point out that dichotomy as we go through these slides, but it's important at the outset to keep that in mind. Just because the law says you can do it doesn't mean you have to do it. A lot of things are still left up to the individual business or the individual organization in terms of what you impose, rules, restrictions, etc., with respect to employees and volunteers and guests and congregants. Okay, so our first topic is the vaccine mandate. As I said at the outset, of course, this is a huge issue right now, as President Biden announced last week that he intends on having the Federal Health and Safety Organization for Workplaces, OSHA, implement a vaccination mandate for employees. So just a little bit about what that means. So OSHA is a federal administrative agency, and they have many rules that govern workplace safety throughout the country. Most of the time, those rules are implemented through a formal rulemaking process where they publish a rule, and it takes about a year before it goes through the process and goes into effect. What President Biden has proposed and is directing OSHA to do is issue what is called an emergency temporary standard, an ETS. And with an ETS, you don't have to go through that entire rulemaking process that can last a year. You can implement it very quickly. So that is what this vaccine mandate is going to be included in, an ETS, an emergency temporary standard. Now, President Biden has announced that the intent is for this emergency temporary standard to only apply to businesses with 100 employees or more. And by the way, that will be focused on not just businesses with 100 employees at a particular site, but businesses that have 100 or more employees at multiple sites throughout the country. So employers that may have only 5 employees in Arizona, but have 50 employees in California and 50 employees in Oregon, they're going to exceed that 100 employee threshold, and the ETS is going to be applicable to them when it is issued. The broad parameters of what has been announced is that employers will either have to require that employees become fully vaccinated or undergo weekly testing. And of course, like most things, the devil's in the details. It is completely unclear at this point whether or not employees who are just partially vaccinated are going to get out of the weekly testing requirement or whether they have to be fully vaccinated. It is completely unclear at this point what kind of weekly testing is going to be required, whether that weekly testing has to be on work time or non-work time, and who's going to pay for the testing. All of that is going to be included in the ETS, and OSHA is going to be responsible for filling in all the details. When will that happen? I would say probably within a month, maybe sooner, but it's not going to happen overnight. There are a lot of minutia and details that need to be worked out and language drafted before they issue this ETS. One thing that is clear, President Biden is directing OSHA to include in the ETS a requirement that employees be given time off with pay to receive vaccination if they are unvaccinated, and that if they are suffering from any after effects from vaccination, that they receive time off with pay while they recover, which is very similar to what California has required in their ETS, which I'm going to talk about in a second, as well as in the California Supplemental Paid COVID Sick Leave Law, which I'll also talk about a little bit later. So the important thing to recognize about this ETS is it is going to govern in all states. This is not just a California thing. This is a federal thing. And the second thing is that state OSHA, those states that have a state OSHA agency, there's about 20 of them, their state OSHA agency is going to have to issue their own ETS that follows the the Fed OSHA guidelines. Okay, so in California in particular, there was a proposed mandate that was included in a bill that was pending before the legislature just last week prior to the calendar year legislative deadline. And that bill would have had an employer mandate to require vaccination of its employees. And the bill didn't specify, but the intent, according to the author, was to have it apply to not just big employers, but smaller employers as well. However, they didn't get it through the legislature before the end of the legislative year, which was last Friday. But they are talking about reviving it starting when the legislature comes back in January. So it's very possible that California is going to have a mandate for employers, and other states as well may adopt mandates for employers by legislation. But even if the legislation doesn't get through the legislature, Cal OSHA is, as I mentioned previously, is going to have to revise its ETS to match the federal OSHA mandate. Any state OSHA organization has to have their own mandates that at least are meeting the minimum requirements under FedOSHA. Now, that's not to say that Cal-OSHA has to adopt that 100 employee threshold. Cal-OSHA could say, we are going to require the same vaccination and testing regimen that FedOSHA is going to require, but we're going to require it for all employers, or employers with 5 employees, or employers with 25 employees. It is unlikely that that is going to happen before December, when the next big Cal-OSHA meeting takes place. But it's something that you need to keep an eye on in terms of vaccine mandates coming down from the state of California and from other states, particularly those states that have been more aggressive, like Oregon, for instance, in COVID restrictions. So this is something that we're going to have to keep an eye on, and even with respect to local authorities. I would not be surprised if the County of Los Angeles or the County of San Francisco adopts a mandate that is more strict than either the FedOSHA standard or the Cal-OSHA standard. So that is one aspect of vaccine mandates, and that is these OSHA requirements. But of course, these OSHA requirements are mandates on employers, and they're only applicable to employees. They are not applicable when it comes to volunteers and congregants. And even though there is not a FedOSHA or Cal-OSHA vaccine requirement right now, employers are still able to have, as I mentioned in our previous webinar, a mandatory vaccination policy for their employees. So putting aside what FedOSHA is going to do or what Cal-OSHA is going to do, as an employer, you can require that employees get vaccinated, and you do not have to have that get vaccinated or test exemption. You can say, doesn't matter whether you're testing weekly or biweekly or whatever the case may be, we're requiring everybody within the organization that's an employee to get vaccinated. And I do have not a lot, but a fair number of clients that have adopted those policies. Now, recognize, as you probably are aware, there are exemptions. There's an exemption if an employer adopts a mandatory vaccination policy for employees who have medical conditions that contraindicate against vaccination. In other words, they've got a condition that a doctor says should prevent them from getting vaccinated to avoid complications. And if an employee is going to ask for that exemption, of course, they need some sort of certification or proof from the physician that they do have that medical condition. And there's also an exemption for people who communicate sincere religious beliefs that vaccination would violate the guidelines of their religious beliefs or their strongly held ethical position. And there's a whole process that employers should go through if they're going to adopt a mandatory vaccination policy that allows for people to submit a written exemption and for the employer to consider that exemption and then determine what accommodations should be made for that person who is asserting the need for accommodation due to a medical condition or a religious belief. If, for example, teleworking is available and the employee can perform their job at home, that may be a reasonable accommodation for someone who has a medical condition and cannot get vaccinated. I should mention that these exemptions are required under the Title VII, the federal anti-discrimination laws, because Title VII requires that you accommodate people with disabilities and you accommodate people with sincere religious beliefs. And likewise in California, these exemptions are required under the state anti-discrimination provisions. It is likely but not entirely clear, but likely that the federal OSHA vaccination requirement and the state, any state that adopts a similar requirement would include those exemptions. And of course, the argument is that, well, if you have a religious belief, that's fine. You don't have to get vaccinated, but you're going to have to test every week. So I just wanted to mention that. But certainly if an employer adopts a mandatory vaccination policy separate and apart from what Fed OSHA or Cal OSHA or any state is going to do, they have to include those exemptions in their policy and in their practice. Now that comes to, what do we do about volunteers and congregants? Is it lawful for an organization to require that its volunteers get vaccinated? Is it lawful for an organization to require that its congregants get vaccinated? And there's no prohibition on requiring vaccination as a condition of participation in church events, for instance, or in religious gatherings, or as a condition of entering into the church's facilities. So there's nothing in the law that says that you as an entity can't require that people get vaccinated and show proof of vaccination upon entry. It's not to say you have to do it, not to say you should do it, but if you decide that it's important, for instance, for volunteers to be vaccinated because they're working with children, and as we know, children under 12 cannot get vaccinated yet, it's not been approved, and they're going to be exposed to potentially COVID. Could you mandate that? Yes, you could. And furthermore, the EEOC and DFEH guidelines that require the medical condition exemption and the religious exemption, those only apply when we're talking about employees. They would not apply for people who are volunteers, guests, or congregants. So if your entity decided to have a vaccine mandate, let's say for volunteers, and a volunteer says, well, I'm refusing to get vaccinated because of my religious belief, you would not have to make an accommodation for that volunteer. You would be able to say simply, I'm sorry, we no longer can have you volunteer for the organization. So you have, again, the freedom to impose vaccine mandates for volunteers and congregants. If you choose, you're certainly not required to. There's nothing in the law that requires it. And that is simply up to your individual entity. Okay. And I just want to mention that I know that there's questions that people are posing, and we certainly are going to work through those questions at the end of the presentation. Appreciate your patience, but I'm going to move on to the next topic, which is proof of vaccination. So again, we're going to talk first about employees and what do you have to do and what can you do when it comes to proof of vaccination. And then we'll talk about non-employees like volunteers and congregants. So first of all, in California, under the Cal OSHA guidelines, employers are required to ascertain the vaccination status of their employees. Cal OSHA issued a rule a little bit earlier this summer, back in June, that said that employers have to find out from their employees, are they vaccinated? And you don't have to ask employees to show their vaccine card or proof of vaccination. All Cal OSHA requires is that you ask, and it's kind of on the honor system. But putting aside the OSHA guidelines, if you want to require proof, you certainly can. You certainly can ask employees to show proof of vaccination if you choose, but the Cal OSHA guidelines do not require it. All they require is that you ask people, are you vaccinated? Are you fully vaccinated? Are you not vaccinated? Are you declining to state? And to keep records to show the vaccination status of their employees. Now that raised a major issue at the time, and I got a lot of questions about it. Well, doesn't this violate HIPAA? And the answer is no, because HIPAA, no, qualified no. HIPAA only governs healthcare providers. And HIPAA requires that healthcare providers maintain the confidentiality of private healthcare information. But employers, generally speaking, are not governed by HIPAA unless they also happen to be a healthcare provider. However, so it's not a HIPAA violation. And a lot of employees are like, well, you can't ask me that. I have HIPAA rights. Well, no, HIPAA is very specific to the healthcare realm. And employers can and are actually required to ask about vaccination status by Cal OSHA. Cal OSHA has specified, though, that you are required to maintain the confidentiality of the information once you gather it. In other words, you can't run around and say, oh, Mary, Joe, Sam, and Fred are all unvaccinated. And you can't leave any forms that people fill out showing their vaccination status laying around. It needs to be kept confidential under lock and key. But employers are required to find out whether their employees are vaccinated. And there's a reason for that from Cal OSHA's standpoint, because there's certain rules that apply for unvaccinated employees that don't apply to vaccinated employees, which I'll talk about a little bit later. So actually, I'll talk about it now. The reason why Cal OSHA has put this in place is that vaccination status exempts employees from some COVID safety rules. So for instance, vaccinated employees are not required under Cal OSHA guidelines to wear masks indoors. And I should mention, and I'll probably mention it later as well, there is no Fed OSHA standard currently that has COVID safety rules like the ones we're talking about with Cal OSHA, except for in healthcare facilities. So the only emergency temporary standard to date that Fed OSHA has issued applies to healthcare facilities. It is very likely that when Fed OSHA issues its vaccination mandate ETS, that they include in there things like the Cal OSHA guideline here that requires unvaccinated employees to wear masks while they're working indoors. But as of right now, we're strictly talking about what Cal OSHA requires. The other big exemption that employees have, if they are vaccinated, is that they are not required to quarantine if they have close contact with an infected individual at work. Under Cal OSHA guidelines, if someone is within close contact, meaning within 6 feet for 15 minutes or more cumulatively, and it turns out that the person they had close contact with is infected, then the unvaccinated employee has to quarantine, but a vaccinated employee does not. And when I say quarantine, I mean stay out of work for 10 days. So that's the reason why Cal OSHA said we are going to require employers to at least go through the process of ascertaining vaccination status. Now, I know that raises an issue. Well, if it's on the honor system, what's to prevent employees from saying, yeah, I'm vaccinated? I think that it's very likely that going down the road when Cal OSHA and maybe Fed OSHA put out revised ETS documents, that they push the onus on employers to ask for actual proof, particularly if there's a vaccine mandate. But as of right now, there is no requirement to actually get proof from the employees that they are vaccinated. So that's the rules regarding proof of vaccination right now. Outside of California, most states do not have that kind of distinction between vaccinated and unvaccinated employees. Most states don't have rules requiring people to mask indoors. I will mention that, again, there is some differentiation, not on the state level, but even down to the local level. For instance, San Francisco has recently adopted a requirement that people show proof of vaccination to go into bars, restaurants, gyms, etc. Now, that doesn't apply to churches, but it's going in that direction. would be what I would say, that your localities, the big localities like San Francisco, LA, big cities, Houston, Phoenix, they're going in that direction to require proof of vaccination. And that would apply to employees and non-employees. So let's talk about non-employees. There's no requirement currently to ascertain vaccination status of volunteers, guests, or congregants anywhere in the country that I'm aware of. So no requirement under the law for a church to ascertain whether people are vaccinated or not, except here in California, they've adopted a rule recently that if in the state, for mega events where there's more than 1,000 attendees, and this would apply to concerts and sporting events, but also religious gatherings, that you have to ascertain vaccination status of people attending. So that is the only exception currently. Now, there was a bill introduced again in the last legislative session that would have required bars, restaurants, and gyms to verify vaccination status, similar to what I mentioned just a minute ago about what San Francisco did. So this was a California bill, again, did not get passed in time before the end of the legislative session, but I would not be surprised to see it come back to life in January. And depending on what happens this winter, I wouldn't be surprised if it's extended beyond bars, restaurants, and gyms to other entities, maybe even including churches. We don't know what this winter is going to hold in terms of another surge of COVID or a double dip of a bad flu season plus COVID. So again, that's something to monitor very closely, because there very well may be a proof of vaccination requirement in states like California going forward into 2022. Now, what I just talked about is legal requirements, right? Now let's talk about what you can do. So in most states, California included, you can require proof of vaccination to participate in events or enter facilities. There's nothing in the law that prohibits a church from saying, hey, we're going to be having a big event and we're going to require people to show proof of vaccination. Now, from a practical standpoint, I think it's a very difficult thing to achieve, to obtain compliance, to force people to show proof of vaccination, to participate or come to services or whatever the case may be. But in most states, you are not legally prevented from trying to do so. Now, there are about 20 states, probably Florida is the most, the biggest example, where the state has prohibited either the government issuing or businesses or organizations requiring vaccine passports, proof of vaccination. Again, you have to look at what's going on in your local jurisdiction. There are states that have said, no, we're not going to allow anybody to require proof of vaccination to enter a facility, to participate in an event, or to go to a business. So again, this is something that is changing. It's changing probably weekly, and it may change depending on, again, how difficult this winter is in terms of COVID surges. I would predict that California is likely to adopt vaccine passports for entry into a lot of businesses next year. Now, whether that will extend to churches, tough to say. I would say, maybe they're a little bit smarting from the defeats that they've suffered, which I'll talk about in a second. But that's certainly not out of the realm of possibility. But California, like New York, has been much more strict in its COVID protocols than some other states. So let's talk about why California is a little bit smarting from licking their wounds from the defeats that they've suffered in the courts. As you probably are aware, when California adopted the bans on church attendance or restrictions on church attendance that were greater than what California was adopting for businesses, there was a flurry of lawsuits. And ultimately, the U.S. Supreme Court issued an injunction overturning the bans on attendance that California had issued on the grounds that it was interference with the exercise of the free exercise of religion under the First Amendment. And the reason the Supreme Court ruled that way was because, as I said, the restrictions that California adopted were greater than those placed on businesses. And it was a very, very powerful argument to say, hey, look, why do we only are we required to only let 25% of congregants in for a service where Costco can have 100%? And the court said, yeah, that doesn't make sense. Now, not to say that a restriction on attendance that is equal to restrictions on private businesses wouldn't pass muster. It's very possible that, for instance, if California were to reimpose a 50% attendance restriction across the board, that the court would say, hey, we're not treating churches and religious organizations any differently than any other organization, and therefore it's constitutional. We don't know yet. I will say that with the results of the recall election, I wouldn't be surprised if California moves towards a more robust COVID enforcement as we go forward, because I think the recall hanging over Governor Newsom's head probably kept him from issuing some executive orders that he might otherwise have issued during the Delta surge. So this is something that we're going to have to wait and see whether or not there's anything reimposed. But basically, the pending litigation was settled in June of most all the pending cases, because of course the injunction was just preliminary. So there's not anything that I know of that is currently going forward to the Supreme Court, any major cases, because most of those cases settled. Now, the interesting thing about those settlements is that the state agreed that any future restrictions must be the same as those on private business. So again, the state can't go beyond what they're doing for private businesses if they adopt restrictions down the road. And of course, the second thing is a lot of those churches, not a lot, all of those that settled got their attorney's fees paid. And the state had to pony up, in some cases, over $1 million in attorney's fees for prosecuting these cases. So that was a victory for religious organizations asserting their rights under the First Amendment, which I think was the correct decision by the Supreme Court. And that at least will keep some brakes on the state going forward in terms of restricting church attendance. Okay, our last topic is just kind of generally COVID safety requirements. Again, talking about employees first and then talking about volunteers and congregants. So keep in mind that the Cal OSHA employee COVID rules that have been in effect since November of 2020 are still in effect and will remain in effect until January of 2022. I would anticipate that when OSHA meets in December, that they will extend those rules even farther. But as of right now, the emergency temporary standard is in effect until January of 2022, which means that, again, as I mentioned previously, Cal OSHA requires unvaccinated employees to wear masks indoors around other employees and to maintain social distancing. So if they're in their own office, they can take their mask off. If they're eating, they can take their mask off. But otherwise, unvaccinated employees are still required to wear masks indoors. Now, there has been a question of whether or not vaccinated employees have to wear masks indoors. There is no requirement. CDC and the California Department of Public Health have recommended that vaccinated employees and other individuals wear masks indoors. But that is just a recommendation. There is no requirement as of right now. Whether or not that's going to come back now that especially the recall's been defeated, or whether or not that'll be included in the Fed OSHA ETS, we'll have to see. But as of right now, unvaccinated employees must wear masks, and they must be quarantined if they're exposed at work and paid for the quarantine period under the Cal/OSHA guidelines. So if someone is exposed at work, they have to be paid for the 10 days that they are required to quarantine. And additionally, a lot of the other requirements that I covered in some detail in the previous webinar are still in effect. You have to provide training to people on COVID. You have to provide masks. Must make masks available to employees. You must have cleaning and disinfecting on a regular basis, and do your best to maintain social distancing. All those rules still remain in effect. So all those rules are designed to protect the health and safety of employees and the health and safety of congregants and volunteers. I think, as I've mentioned, federal OSHA is likely to adopt similar rules when it publishes its ETS. So if you're not in California and you don't have this kind of detailed rules regarding COVID, I think it's on its way, and you should be prepared and pay attention because you want to make sure that you follow those rules. One of the things that has been announced is that Fed OSHA intends on having a $14,000 fine for violations of its ETS. So whether they can enforce that is questionable. There's only like 1,500 OSHA inspectors across the country. So I don't know how they're going to, likely what they will do is they will do what Cal/OSHA sometimes does. They will find some unlucky company and make them example, hit them with hundreds of thousands of dollars of fines, publicize it, and try to use that to get everybody else scared and in compliance. But I would expect that you're going to see more rules coming down the road. The one other thing I want to mention regarding employees, there's currently in California a rule, or a law actually, that says that if you have more than 25 employees, that you must pay employees COVID sick pay if they're out of work due to exposure or infection, whether that happened at work or outside work. But that expires on September 30th, and it has not been extended and will not be extended unless the governor issues some sort of executive order before the legislature reconvenes in January. So if any of you have more than 25 employees, that supplemental COVID sick pay goes away as of September 30th. So let's talk briefly about safety requirements involving volunteers, congregants, and guests. So again, that's going to vary by jurisdiction. If, for example, in Los Angeles County or Santa Barbara County, there's rules on masking and social distancing indoors, then you got to follow those rules. If you're in Orange County, like me, where we don't have currently any masking rules for people attending church services, for instance, you don't have to enforce that. So it just depends on your jurisdiction. Whether you can, again, is a different question. And certainly churches can require staff, volunteers, congregants to follow whatever masking and social distancing requirements you feel is necessary to protect the health and safety of everybody who worships with you, as well as the health and safety of your staff and your pastors and your volunteers. So you certainly have, unless you're in one of those states that, like Florida is the one I can think of most specifically, that has prohibitions on adopting masking rules, you certainly are entitled to adopt whatever rules you feel are necessary to protect health and safety. And as we go into the flu season, it's probably going to be a good idea to at least have some sort of policy that you have in place to protect, at the very least, staff and volunteers. Okay. I have finished my presentation. There is my lovely picture up there, as well as my email address and my phone number if anybody does want to contact me about anything employment related. And Travis and Julie, I think we're ready for questions.
Yeah, Julie, we've got some good questions here. She's going to start from the top down and fire away here. So,
all right. Thank you, everybody, for submitting your questions through the Q&A. So we got a question from Brent, who says, my congregation leases our meeting space. Who dictates COVID-related policies?
Well, that would be potentially both. The landlord certainly could, if it chose, implement some sort of COVID policies regarding entry to its premises. They don't have to, but they could, depending on the jurisdiction, right? If they're in LA County, for instance, and LA County says you have to wear masks indoors, then the landlord would likely say, well, any lease groups got to follow the LA County guidelines. And then your group could enforce whatever COVID protocols you feel are necessary, again, in line with what your local jurisdiction requires. So I think if the landlord decides to put on a protocol that you're not in agreement with, I think the landlord's decision would probably take precedence, because usually your lease is going to say that the landlord can put conditions on entry, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So the answer is you both can.
Okay, great. And we did have a few questions on this one. Do contractors count as employees?
Well, how long do we have? That is a good question. Let's narrow it down to Cal OSHA. Cal OSHA governs the workplace, and contractors would not necessarily fall into the category of employees that are governed by Cal OSHA regulations. However, because it's such a difficult distinction between who's a contractor and who's an employee, and you have equity considerations, I would certainly require any contractors to follow the same Cal OSHA guidelines that employees follow in terms of masking, social distancing, et cetera. Whether you have to find out their vaccination status, I think the answer to that is no. Now, whether or not, this is another one of those things that's going to be filled in on the details, right? Will Fed OSHA require that contractors get vaccinated? I don't know if they will. I think that raises some legal considerations, and there's already a whole bunch of legal considerations involved as to whether or not Fed OSHA can even put this vaccination mandate in place. And the more ammunition they give to the people who are going to challenge the vaccination mandate legally, I think the worse off they are. So I think it's going to be limited just to employees, would be my guess.
Great. We have a question from Robert. Our nonprofit status is based on our association agreement with the home office. We have our own separate EIN. We have 15 employees, but the organization as a whole has over 100. Are we held to the 100, or do we come in with our local 15 employees in our local church?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm going to punt a little bit because those are the kind of things that need to be fully set forth in whatever Fed OSHA requires. But I can extrapolate from other laws and kind of give you my educated guess. The fact that there's a separate EIN would not necessarily excuse compliance based on we don't have 100 employees. There's a lot of laws, Obamacare, Family Medical Leave Act, et cetera, that are based on the number of employees. And under universally all those laws, if there are entities that have basically the same ownership, the same control. They're part of a larger entity. They're going to aggregate the employees. And so, it's going to depend on a lot of different factors that you'd have to look at. But if, again, an educated guess, I would say that you'd likely fall over the 100 employee threshold if there's an association and you're part of that association, and the association has a certain degree of control over your individual entity.
Okay, next question. What does the ETS acronym stand for?
Emergency Temporary Standard. So just to talk a little bit more about the legal challenges to President Biden's plan. An emergency temporary standard is only supposed to be issued by OSHA where there is a immediate and grave danger to the health and safety of employees. Because it's an emergency temporary standard, as I mentioned at the outset, Fed OSHA doesn't have to go through all of the required hoops that any other administrative agency has to jump through to put a new rule in place. With an ETS, they can just put it in place and it, happens more overnight. But they have to be able to prove that it is a grave and immediate danger. And that's a pretty high standard under Supreme Court precedent. So for Fed OSHA to adopt this emergency temporary standard that requires vaccination, I think there's a pretty good argument that having unvaccinated employees in the workplace does not pose the kind of grave and immediate threat to health and safety that would be required by the courts. Now, there's obviously a counter argument, but I think that's probably the biggest way that's going to be attacked. Now, if I was arguing in front of the Supreme Court, I would say, and I don't know why it's been framed this way by the Biden administration, I would say this isn't a vaccination mandate. This is a testing mandate. We require all employees to test once a week for COVID. Now, you can get out of the testing mandate if you're vaccinated. And I think that would probably withstand legal challenge because OSHA requires all sorts of testing, respiratory, mask testing, et cetera, et cetera.
Great. Next question comes from Kate. Are you obligated to provide an accommodation for religious beliefs, even if that person is of the same religious faith of our organization? For example, Judaism mandates vaccines, but one of our teachers has applied for an exemption on religious grounds.
Ooh, that's a great question. So in order to meet the exemption, someone has to put forward a sincere religious belief. Now, that does not have to even be based on a religion. It can be based on a ethical or moral belief that is very deep-seated. Now, most of the time when we go into the religious exemption, it's based on a direct, I can point to something in the religious teachings, let's say for Catholics, regarding use of fetal tissue in developing or including in some of the elements of the vaccine. And that can be disputed, of course, but it would still be something that would be based in some level of religious doctrine. So if someone says, I am asserting my religious belief is based upon Judaism, I think it would be difficult to prove that. And I think the employer could challenge that and say, no, I need more information as to what is it in particular within Judaism that you think prevents you from being vaccinated. But if the employee would come back and say, well, it's not based on the Torah or any specific Jewish teaching, but I have a belief that God created man and woman, and that our body's a temple, and I don't like putting anything in my body, and I think it's wrong morally to put anything in my body that would interfere with my relationship with God. It gets real gray, right? I would certainly require the employee to jump through a number of hoops before, have to write out something pretty specific. And again, the employer's got to determine whether that's sincere or not, or whether it's just, I don't like vaccines. I mean, if you've got a record that the employee's taking the flu shot every year, and now they're saying, I don't believe in vaccines, I think you could say, that's not gonna fly.
Okay, great. Next question is from Patty. If reasonable accommodation cannot be made for someone's disability under the ADA, an employer is not obligated to continue to employ that person. Would that also be true for vaccine exemption?
Right. That's correct. So the question is, can the employee perform the essential functions of their job with or without accommodation? Okay. If you say, I'm requiring employees to be vaccinated, employee says, I have a religious objection, and let's say it's bona fide and sincere and in good faith. But that employee needs to be at work at a physical location in order to perform their job. And there's no accommodation where they can be on their own, alone, and they're not going to have any interaction with others. In that circumstance, if there's no accommodation that you could identify that would allow the employee to continue performing their essential functions and not be vaccinated, then it's either one or two things. The employee goes on leave, right, until they decide that, yep, okay, I'm going to get vaccinated, or the employee's terminated.
Okay.
But if you can accommodate them, then you probably need to. And if accommodation for things like telework, if you can accommodate them, or if their job doesn't require them to be front facing and they're in an office all day, and they're not going to interact with anybody, they keep 6 feet away and they wear a mask and so forth and so on, then you probably have to accommodate that.
I think we're going to go to one last question just to make sure we honor the 1 hour. Do know that if you did ask a question, Erick has been great about helping us answer those and getting those back to you directly. So let's go with our last question. And then a lot of questions about, we will send all attendees a link to this webinar, as well as post it on our website in a couple of days. So I know some had to step out and missed a little bit, so we'll definitely make sure we get that to you. All right, take it away, Julie. Last question.
All right, last question is from Patty. We require our employees to wear masks if 2 or more are present in the same area of the building. Our county has an indoor mask mandate. If we wanted to maintain that requirement, should local mask mandates be lifted? Are we allowed to?
Yes, absolutely. So you're free to put in any health and safety rules and requirements that you choose as an employer. So even if your locality is not requiring it, or the state's not requiring it, you can still do it. So mask mandates aren't, they're not the same as vaccines. Very difficult. I mean, you can have an exception for medical conditions, but it'd be very hard to have an exception for religious beliefs.
Well, Erick, I can't thank you enough. A lot of great info. Again, we'll send out this link to the webinar and the slides. Obviously, this whole thing was recorded. Several of you, I know we did not get your questions, but again, we will get to your question, and we'll send those out responses to those as soon as we can. So thanks again. Again, Eric, appreciate your time.
Thank you, everybody. Have a great day.
All right. Bye-bye.